So hi everybody. Sorry to keep you waiting. We encountered some traffic on our way from Delhi. Okay, you can see that over there and I can advance it here. Okay. It's great to be here and see everyone, and thank you for waiting so that I could give this presentation. As you may have heard, I'm a professor of kinesiology and physical education at the University of Toronto, and I'm also a vice president of that university and principal Can you hear me if I talk like this? Okay, let's try this. Then we can have a discussion. Okay? I preface this talk by a historical generalization about the nature of modern sports. We have to understand sports today and in its modern state as deeply gendered practice. Begun, invented, created in the early 19th century in industrialized Britain as an explicitly, consciously, intentionally form of socialization for upper-class boys and men, as a way of strengthening masculine power at a time of discombobulating changes in that society, changes would undermine traditional masculinity, and as a way of asserting other forms of power, class power, and national power, and in the case of Britain, imperialist power. As many of you know, in the history of the British Raj, sport was one of the vehicles by which the British imperialists sought to gain legitimacy for themselves and inculcate the Indian population in British culture. And the whole history of sport in India is in part a story of the dynamics of assertion and resistance and adaptation of this project. Given the great possibilities of sport, given the joys, the education, the discipline, the benefits that sports create, those who were initially excluded from this project sought to do it for themselves. They sought to create their own opportunities. They sought to climb over or break down the fences. They sought to join up. And I would say, as a historian, the whole history of sports over the last 200 years has been in part a story of the struggle for accessibility, inclusion, self-direction in sports. One of the most important themes of that long struggle has been the struggle by girls and women in every society we know to win opportunities for themselves. And so that's a background or a context for what I'm going to say today. I have direct familiarity with this story in India. It's hard to believe, but when I was not much older than you, I came to India and I spent a year teaching at the University of Rajasthan in Jaipur. And because of my interest in sport back then, I traveled around India looking at the way that sport was developed. Hard to believe, but I did. As evidence of that, this is one of the articles that I published back in Canada in 1966 about sport in India at that time. One of the stories that I uncovered and reported on in the 1960s was the struggle by girls and women in Rajasthan for opportunities for themselves, assisted by supportive coaches and teachers. And it was a remarkable story. There were episodes where teachers and coaches were beaten up because they tried to coach young women. And they could have been more seriously harmed if it wasn't for the women themselves saying, this is something I want to do. And gradually gradually in the course of that time, girls and women in Rajasthan became part of the sports scene. As you know, in the last 50 years, there's been a tremendous growth in opportunities and improvement in performances by girls and women in Indian sport. Some of the very best Indian athletes, period, are women. Some of the great Rio stories from last year's Olympics are Indian women. And at the level of participation, it's an encouraging story. But that being said, in India and in every other country of the world, there's still a long way to go in this struggle. Funding is still woefully inadequate in most countries, and I begin with my own. The media portrayal of sport is still overwhelmingly male and sexist. If you were to open up the Times of India this morning, or the Hindustan, or any other newspaper, or look on India TV or any of the channels, and you saw sport being portrayed, you would assume that it was still a male-only activity, because except for a few cases at the time of major games, most of the coverage is male. One of the other dimensions of this inadequacy is at the level of leadership. In most countries in the world, like India, the percentage of women who compete or participate at every level is getting up there, 30, 40%. Next year at the Commonwealth Games in Gold Coast in Australia, there'll be the same number of events for women and men. At the first time any major games has done that. So at the level of participation, it's getting better. But at the level of leadership, it's still controlled by men, and that constitutes or remains a big problem. On this slide, you see the result of one of the relevant studies that my colleagues and I at the University of Toronto have conducted, and in the landscape of university sport, all sport in Canadian universities, while the numbers of women who participate is pretty close to 50%, the number of coaches and leaders who are women is still painfully short. So that's by way of background. One part of this this landscape, or this struggle, or the dynamics or the tension, has been the long-standing practice of men in established sports organizations to distrust or challenge the women who've been involved. Given that men, my kind, want the bragging rights, we're always suspicious if women become too good, because then, of course, they challenge the legitimacy and the claim to exclusivity that the traditional patriarchal view of sport has provided. And in the Olympic sports, and I'm going to continue to narrow my focus, on the Olympic sports, almost from the very beginning, are we okay? Almost from the very beginning of female participation in the Olympic Games, some of the very best athletes have been challenged or doubted or distrusted because maybe they don't conform to conventional femininity, or maybe they just run too fast or throw too far and are considered abnormal. And so for almost 80, 90 years, there's been a systematic attempt to investigate abnormal women in international sport. It began in the 1930s. In the 1960s, it was institutionalized with a universal system of testing called femininity control or sex testing, where every single female competitor in Olympic Games or major games like the Asian Games or the Pan American Games or the Commonwealth Games had to undergo a test so that they could prove themselves that they were women. It was initially a pull down your pants physical examination, honest to God, it was. And then it became a chromosome test, but that was started in the 1960s. My colleagues who view this say it was a response to the fact that two groups of non-Western women a big group from the Soviet bloc in Eastern Europe, and a big group from the global south, from Asia, from Africa, from the Caribbean, started entering sports, looking somewhat differently than the traditional, white middle-class woman who competed up till then, and exacerbating these fears of abnormal women. And so that was part of the Olympic landscape for a number of years. There was huge growing objections to those tests. There was mobilization against it, and in 1999 they were abolished or discontinued. But the governing bodies reserved the right to do it again if they thought the circumstances were there. In 2011, in response to the remarkable South African athletics champion, Caster Semenya, they said, oh my God, there's a new group of abnormal women in our midst, and we've got to reinstitute a test. And they came up with something they called the Female Hyper-Androgenism Regulations. And that went in effect for the London Olympics in 2012. That test was not a universal test. It provided but it provided for targeted women to be tested for natural testosterone, and if women were deemed to have too much, more than 10 nanomoles of natural inherited testosterone, then they could be disqualified. In many cases, if they were tested positive, they were counseled to undergo hormonal therapy or surgery to reduce their natural testosterone. And that's the policy that went into place in 2011, 2012. These tests, the hyperandrogenism tests, were supposed to be confidential. I mean, you can imagine how invasive and how threatening it is. But very little care was taken to protect the identity of the athletes. And we know that in the very first years of this test, at least 30 athletes were tested. And we also know that at least 4 of these women were healthy women, were pressured to undergo surgery as a requirement of staying in competition. All of this has been documented. And sadly, all of the known athletes targeted by this policy came from the global south. So the othering of women from the global south continued in this policy. So let's now move to Dati Chand and India. In 2014, this remarkable woman, at the time the Asian Junior Sprint Champion, chosen for the Commonwealth Games in Glasgow, thought she was being tested for doping for something quite differently, and they said, "You've got too much testosterone. You are suspended." She was encouraged by her coach, by the Athletics Federation of India, and by her manager to undergo therapy or surgery in order to reduce her natural testosterone. And to her enormous credit, she said, "No way. I refuse to do this. This is me. I'm not going to alter who I am." But because of that refusal, she was suspended by the national body here in India and by the International Amateur Sport Federation. And that was a lifetime suspension. A lifetime suspension. A young woman who had remarkable ability, ambition, and spent her life in sport and faced never competing again. With the assistance of a group of scholars, one of whom, Dr. Payoshni Mitra, spoke here last year, a good colleague and friend who I'd hoped who'd be with me tonight, this afternoon, to share in this presentation, but unfortunately could not come, but sends her regrets. She got in touch with Dutty, who got in touch with another colleague who got in touch with me, and we started a defense. We started a defense strategy. Because of my own work in athletes' rights, we thought we could appeal to the International Court of Arbitration for Sport, which is the Supreme Court of international sport. And we were able to launch an appeal that called for her unconditional reinstatement and the complete abolition of the regulations by which she was suspended. It was an international team. It was financed by the Sport Authority of India, or SAI. The legal work was done by two Toronto lawyers who did it on a volunteer basis. So SAI paid for their expenses, but they volunteered their time. And I'm proud to say that I was a member of the strategic and scientific team. Peyoshni Katrina Karkazis from Stanford University in the US and I provided the arguments, the evidence, and so on. At the same time, we launched an international petition, and all over the world, athletes, coaches, human rights activists, and others signed up. Very encouraging worldwide support. The appeal process was formal. Our appeal was submitted initially in September of 2014. It took, the way these things go, the briefs on our side by the IAAF until, and the scheduling of the hearing. But that hearing was in Lausanne, where CAS is located, in March of 2015. It was a 4-day hearing, and in addition to Chand herself and the presentation by the lawyers, our side called 8 witnesses, and the IAAF called 9. So it was a full hearing into this issue. If anybody's interested in reading about it, as I will mention in a minute, the final decision is available on the web. I could even share a copy with you because it's on this disc or on this stick, and you could distribute it to the class. What were the arguments that we made in our appeal? I'm going to briefly take you through the 5 main arguments that we made, and then tell you how it was settled, and then talk a little bit about the way ahead. First of all, Chand was not doping. She wasn't injecting. She wasn't taking testosterone orally. She was simply running on her own chemicals. I used to be involved a great deal in anti-doping campaigns, and I used to tell athletes to play with their own chemicals. Don't dope. Enjoy the benefits, the learning of sport under your own steam. Enjoy sport as you are. Chand was playing with her own chemicals, and yet she was suspended. We argued that was nuts and unfair. Secondly, we summarized the scientific literature on the relationship between natural inherent testosterone and athletic performance, and we found virtually no evidence of a strong relationship. And here are 2 of the articles that we were able to submit it. That in terms of the evidence, peer-reviewed evidence that natural testosterone correlates to high performance is just not there. And lots of other anecdotal evidence too. In Canada, I won't tell you her name, but one of the most famous female athlete, captain of several Olympic winning teams, told me in the course of this. She said, Bruce, I'm the best player in my sport in the world, and we're regularly tested, and my testosterone is among the lowest. There's not any relationship. And then we made an ethical or social scientific argument. We said, there are a lot of differences in sport. In addition to biochemistry, there's all kinds of physical differences. Some people have, incredible reach. Some people have incredible height. Some people have more fast twitch fibers, in order for sprinting, and. We don't regulate any of these. We celebrate people because of their height and so on. The then Director General of the Sport Authority of India said in the midst of this debate, listen, Usain Bolt is 3-time Olympic champion because of his long legs and his ability to turn over his legs, those long legs and those incredible strides. We don't chop them off at the knees in order to create fair sport. We celebrate people as they are. As a social scientist, the point I made in this was that if you want to look at a factor that correlates to athletic performance in a really singular way, the literature suggests that we should be looking at national and personal income. If you look at the Olympic tables, you'll see that the athletes, or in the countries with the highest number, are the richest countries. And within the rich countries, for the most part, the athletes who come from the richest families, because of the resources that are available there that are part of sport. But they never, we don't have a tax for that in sport. The ancient Greeks were worried about a fair playing field. So in the ancient Olympic Games, athletes had to get to Olympia, the site of the Games, 3 months ahead of the Games, and all live in the same dormitory, all eat the same food, all have the same trainers and so on, as a way of trying to equalize things for everybody so riches would not. So I've said in this debate, maybe we should do the same thing for the modern Olympic Games and choose a middle-income country. I don't know, my example is Botswana or Sri Lanka, and have every athlete live in that country for a year before the Games, eating the same food, sleeping in the same beds, having the same level of coach, and then, but we never say that. We never say that. So why demonize one hormone in this thing? The Olympic movement celebrates humanity in all its diversity. Why single out one area of difference? Even if there was a demonstrated link, which there's not. Obviously, it's discriminatory against women. In my country, the anti-doping agency, the agency that tests athletes for doping, has refused to administer this test because it violates all of the state human rights provisions. And that's true now for India, and it's true for Australia. And finally, we made the argument of the probabilities of harm. And Pioshny, Dr. Mitra, contributed a lot to this. On the one hand, since 1936, when this kind of testing was initiated, there's only been one case of a man masquerading as a woman. And that was an athlete that the Nazis got to masquerade as a woman for the high jump in 1936. But since 1936, absolutely not a single case. So there, with all of this technology and effort and so forth, no man has been proven to be masquerading. And yet, large numbers of women have been demonized by this test, have been terrified, There's been a chill created. And this is not only women in the global south. This is not only women who may come from a different genetic background. This is every single woman. I have a student, actually she's graduated by now, but she's conventionally feminine female athlete. And she said to me, I'm terrified by this. This policy means that any coach who doesn't like me, or who doesn't like the way that I've changed the way I look, or my latest tattoo, is going to target me and says I'm not quite what should, and they could force me to undergo this test. And Dr. Mitra Payoshny has documented the fear that this test has created all over India. Athletes have enough stress in training and competition than to worry that someone is going to target them, single them out, and suggest that there's something wrong with them. So we made these arguments in Lausanne. We underwent cross-examination. It was like a legal trial. On July the 24th, 2015, a historic day, the court ruled in Chan's favor. She was reinstated, allowed to get back into competition, and boy, has she ever taken off from that point. She's serially lowered the Indian record. She competed in Rio, the first Indian sprinter to compete in the 100 meters since 1980. She's gone from strength to strength. CAS also suspended the regulations the first time an appeal against a policy, a law, has ever been upheld. Their key finding was basically that they agreed with our point number 2. There's no scientific evidence that is convincing that there's such a difference created by natural testosterone that there has to be a special policy from this. And as I say, I'm happy to show you the 163-page, or share that with you, which argues this in chapter and verse. In the absence of such evidence, the panel is unable to conclude that the hyperandrogenic female athletes may enjoy such a significant performance advantage that it is necessary to exclude them from competing in the female category. You'd like to think that the governing bodies would comply with a court finding, but they were very, very, very reluctant. In the first place, they never communicated this decision in any kind of broad way, so much that when Payoshny did her interviews all over India, months after the decision, very few actual athletes and coaches knew about it. We had to force their hand by using the media to write critical stories, which led them to say in February of 2016 that the test will not affect anybody training for Rio. They also convened a secret meeting of all the witnesses on their side, and they issued a statement that said, we think the court is nuts and we should appeal. Interestingly enough, at that secret meeting, there were 6 of the witnesses on their side and none of the witnesses on our side. Talk about unrepentant. The court suspended the regulations, but they only did that for 2 years, during which time the IAAF and AFI have a chance to go back and appeal the decision. If they launch an appeal, they've got to be able to prove that, in fact, there is such an advantage that there needs to be a rule. They keep on threatening to appeal, but we haven't seen one yet. Our reading of the literature that's been published since 2014 suggests that they could not make an argument. And if the IAAF does appeal, our side has the right of counter-argument. If by July of this year they fail to launch an appeal or succeed in appeal, the law, the regulations go down for all time. For us, for me personally, we should abolish this approach to sport once and for all, and we should respect and affirm the essential right of gender identity, which is fundamental to human rights and should be fundamental to the basis of sport, which is the expression, the self-expression of individual identity. And Dati Chan, this remarkable athlete, she says it best. I still do not understand why the IOC or the IAAF think they may need such a rule at all. I should be able to run the way I was born. So thank you very much for your attention, and I would be pleased to answer your questions or hear any comments from you. And I'd love some bottled water if that was possible. Sorry, I'm a little dry here, and I hope you don't mind if I take my jacket off. Okay, fire away.
Yes, any questions?
Sir, at the back.
I think sir, my observation has been that see, outside bodybuilding and powerlifting circles, anabolic steroids doesn't work. Because for them to work, you have to break muscles. Only then they can create a, technically speaking, positive nitrogen balance for the muscles to repair and then again, form at a better level. But in athletics, that muscle breakage doesn't happen. And because athletics being more of aerobic training rather than anaerobic training, which is, I'm able to make my point.
I'm not sure I understand you in that, but
And that basically sports your second argument, which says that testosterone level, the level of testosterone in blood doesn't have any link with the athletic performance.
that is, well, I shouldn't say no link, but there's not a predictable, significant link. So, there may be some for some athletes, but not for others, and even the sum may not be such that it's so big that you want to create a separate category for those athletes. I have not seen any evidence of that.
Yes, sir. I was making the same point, but I was saying that there is hardly any link, sir. Because athletics is more of the point I'm trying to make is that outside bodybuilding in powerlifting circles, the testosterone and anabolic steroids doesn't work. So, and the athletic federation's argument that I doubt they will be able to prove a link between testosterone and increase in athletic performance.
Okay.
Just adding to your point.
Yep. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Any other questions?
And considering the fact that testosterone is the only biological element, shouldn't it be directly linked to the athletic performance of a person? Because it's the only biological element that could possibly be linked, right? Because there's no other biological element that could improve an athletic.
Well, I think that's a question. There are all kinds of genetic features that are linked to some extent to athletic performance.
Yeah, but those genetic features derive from the hormone testosterone. Right? Wouldn't that be a direct link? The genetic features that would help you in a particular situation as an athlete would be linked to the hormone of testosterone. Correct? Isn't that?
I don't think if I'm understanding you correctly,
For example, men in general, they have their muscle capability or the fact that they can run faster or their strength is linked to the hormone that they produce, which is testosterone. So if there were to be a higher level, wouldn't that indicate that there would be an advantage?
Well, I think that's a question. I think that's a question rather than an argument. I think that among women, there is a wide-ranging amount of natural testosterone and a wide-ranging ability to use it to generate athletic performance among women. If there's evidence to the contrary, we haven't seen that. There are, and I guess the point is, sport is not about hormones. Thank you very much. Sport is about, sport is about performance, and it's about culture, and it's about all of those kind of things. We don't ask people to line up on the basis of their hormones. We ask them to line up on the basis of their national identity and so on. And I like that. In terms of male and female performance, the question you pose is the old nurture versus nature. Is the fact that men currently in this historical epoch generally in most sports perform better than women, is that a function of genetics or is that a function of opportunity and training? And there are people who argue both of that. Until we have, I guess our position is, until we have conclusive evidence, let's err on the side of everybody competing rather than creating a very harmful restrictive policy. And your would-be lawyers, in human rights law, the general rule is that everybody should be treated equal unless there is significant evidence that there's something about one category that requires a particular restriction or a particular rule. And we're saying that evidence hasn't yet been produced in this case.
Then why don't men and women compete together?
Well, that's a question of culture and policy. Within youth in Canada, within youth sport, increasingly, men and women and girls and boys are brought together and to compete on the same playing field, because we think the spectrum of abilities it is so overlapping that that's the way they should do. But where you've got cultural divides, I think it's and where you have such current inequities, most of it was to say you need to keep the category of women's sports as a way of protecting women. So in Canada, the law, as a result of a number of cases, allows for one-way integration in sport. So at every level, an outstanding female athlete who might want to compete in boys and men's sport because there's a higher level of skill involved, because the benefits are greater, is legally allowed to do that. But it is not possible for a boy or a man who can't make a boys' team to go into women's sport because according to Canadian law, girls and women yet have not had fair enough opportunity. I'm not sure I'm explaining that well, but that's... So we're living at a time where we're trying to adjust historic inequities, and we're experimenting about how to do that. But I I mean, there are physiologists who argue that in 50 years, in some events, men and women will be competing in the same final. Whether that's going to happen or not is as much a question of how we structure our societies over the next 50 years as genetics and training. Okay, the woman there, and then I haven't forgotten you.
So, since we've been told that most of the targeted victims of these populations have been from the global south, do you think if the same case had happened from outside of this territorial region, would things have worked out differently?
Very differently. I mean, we know that, we think, I mean, I have no evidence, we think that women from the north have been tested and found to present higher levels of testosterone, and those tests have been poured down the toilet or they've been ignored. That's what we think. We have no evidence of that, but that's what we think. Okay, this man has been patient.
Yeah. Before the 2012 Olympic Games, around 20 from the developing nations were tested for this, and they were told to get off their hormones because of the surgery. So, why are they particularly targeting the developing nations, and particularly based on suspicion only they can get a female athletes tested? So, suspicion occurs only on the developing countries and the one who are not female. So why are they particularly targeting and suspicious about the developing countries?
Why? I've offered a conjecture, I've offered a view, but I can't say for sure. The authorities say they want to create fairness, and we can take them on their word, except that they initiated this test around the time when many former colonies were becoming independent nations. I mean, India did it in 1947, but in Africa, the Caribbean, that mostly happened at the 1960s. And more of those women began. And all of a sudden, people said, oh my God, there are all these abnormal women, we got to test them. So that's a conjecture, but the correlation is very, very, very striking. And at the same time, the Soviet Union entered Olympic sport in 1952, and very quickly, and then very soon after that, East Germany, Hungary, and so on. And some of their women were, and they didn't look like, I mean, I competed in the 1964 Olympics. They didn't look like women on our Olympic team. I'm embarrassed to say this, but there were two outstanding Soviet athletes who won a ton of medals, and they were sisters. And I'm embarrassed about this, but they were referred to as the Press Brothers. There was this kind of prejudice against Eastern European, women who were big and strong. Is that the reason? But the correlation is very strong.
Considering that it to be true that testosterone and performance levels have a direct relation, would male athletes, would the male athletes who are good at their sport have higher levels of testosterone than the other ones who don't?
Well, men present, I mean, the ranges of natural testosterone overlap. Most men have more testosterone than the majority of women, but some women have more testosterone than some men. So it's an overlapping range. I should say what I should probably say that in terms of exogenous testosterone or injected testosterone, there's no question that is linked to athletic performance, the doping. But that's different than natural inborn, and the biochemistry is quite different. And you know, there are male athletes who have high levels of testosterone and male athletes who do not. And to what extent is that related to their athletic ability? It's also not predictably the same. It's across the spectrum.
You brought in nature versus nurture, and also you said that biological factors aren't the only thing that matter while segregating between men and women and letting them compete, right? So what about athletes who feel that they are actually women? Let's say a man who feels that he's a woman and a woman who feels she's a man. So there was this German athlete who was doped systematically since the age of 16. She never knew it,
Yeah.
but later on it led to her sex change operation and she turned into a man. But she later admitted that she always felt like a boy. She wanted to be a girl. So why not let gender decide while competing? And why not let's say Catelyn Jenner. So why let them compete with guys? Why not let them compete with women if nurture is so important?
Well, basically that's my position, and I would say it's the consensus position in Canada that as more and more humans can choose their gender and can choose to live socially in a gender that they were not raised as, that they should be able to compete in the gender of their choice as long as they do that on a consistent basis. So it's a very interesting developing area of policy. At the IOC has said female to male trans can compete today in male sport. There's some limits on male to female trans, essentially this policy. But in other countries like Canada, the position is that male to female trans can compete in female sport. Caitlyn Jenner could compete in female sport if that's the operation or that's the path that she did. And will this be our position for all time? Sport is an interesting social experiment, but in Canada, we feel that it's far better to allow people to be able to compete in the basis of their gender than to create a whole series of policies that would really restrict their identity and who they are.
See, but again, if a man who does identify with the female gender, and they're let to compete amongst females,
Yep.
their natural build gives them a certain edge over some women, not all, but some, right? So let's say.
Well, I guess the question is not right. That's something that we have assumed, but there's no really hard evidence that happens in such a consistent way that should be the basis of prohibition.
German athlete that I was.
No. Well, I think that's a very tragic and particular case of the GDR doping system, distorting, a woman then, and there may be, and I'm right now today, standing up here, I'm not sure I have a policy response to that other than to provide her with counseling, legal support, and so on. But if she's now probably, actually she's a he, and he is now in his 40s or 50s. And if he wants to compete in the sport of that gender in Canada, he would be able to do so. And we would say, no big deal. Vive la différence. Let's celebrate the difference of humanity, because no clear evidence that these people, that these fellow humans, are acting in an unfair way. We have a lot of stereotypes. We have a lot of myths about male-female differences, but where is the evidence?
Is is it not true that men are more jaunty and structure-wise, they are bigger than most women? Most men compared to most women. Is it not true? Is there not scientific evidence to prove that?
Well, as a generalization, yes, but sport, there are lots of inequalities in sport. You can line up on a race. You can have a tip-off in basketball. You can you can face a bowler in cricket. You can face someone else who's taller and maybe faster and so on. But if you're more agile, if you're smarter, I mean, sport is full of these. In any competition, there's a tremendous range of abilities and experiences and so on, and that's one of the things that we like about sport. And so let's let people add to that mix on the basis of their chosen gender, and we don't think that'll be terrible. And so far, certainly in the cases I know in Canada, those male to female trans who've gone into women's sport aren't the best athletes. There are lots of cisgender female athletes, women who are born and raised as female, who are better than them. So let's not make all these rules about them. Remember, sport is about bringing people together on difference and having a testing and so on. And we got to break down some of these stereotypes, and allowing people to compete on this basis is one way of doing that.
This is my last question. I will not ask anything to this. Then why does the need for doping even arise if biological components aren't that instrumental in determining your victory?
Well, remember, there's a difference between natural and exogenous testosterone. There is substantial difference that injected testosterone or oral testosterone, taken associated with training, will enhance difference. And that's very different than natural testosterone. There's also a debate about whether or not we should continue anti-doping policy, but I won't get into that today. But I think that there is a confident consensus that there is a world of difference between injected and natural testosterone. So that's why we said Dutti's not doping. If she was, we wouldn't be supporting her, but she's not. Okay, so you haven't asked a question, so I'll ask you and then.
I actually had some observations to make.
Yep.
Comments rather, airing some of the anxieties. Thank you for the talk, that was wonderful. Just makes me wonder about a couple of overarching themes that emerge. One is how little we actually know and how much we rely on keeping stable categories of stereotypes, and why that is very problematic. And how there is a collective sense of complicity in maintaining these stable categories. I mean, I'm thinking about the optics of sports. Whenever we're talking about tennis, for instance, a muscular female tennis player has been constantly ridiculed for being muscular based on those very minimal knowledge of stable categorization and stereotype, whereas for men that discussion never arises.
Is that because she's black or is that because she's muscular?
I think it's a bit of both. All levels of othering, but I think we're all complicit in perpetuating that.
Yep.
We consume that.
Yep.
And, I mean, these bodies are institutional in terms of determining on technical grounds whether this is permissible or not, but it's also up to us to recognize how we are consuming and contributing to this kind of categorizations.
I agree with that, and I think our job as social scientists, as lawyers and so on, is to advance your project, to break down some of these stereotypes for which there is very, very, very little, scientific evidence. One of my colleagues calls these arguments moral physiology, the marshalling of the language of physiology to make what are essentially, moral and power arguments. We got to break those down. I've got another slide deck to talk about what I want the IOC to do, and I in future, if they want to introduce any kind of thing that affects bodies in this way, then I want them to do so in a way that, that is based on peer-reviewed consensus, high standards of evidence, consultation, arm's length decision making, none of which has happened in this long history of policies. You know, when we, and I think this is true about India, when you establish regulations for the environment, for the quality of water, for air quality, for the transmission of diseases, you do that on the basis of study after study after study after study, which is refereed, which is weighed by people, which allows for presentations and so on. In sport, none of that has happened so far. That's what we've got to do to change. But we also have to educate people to break down some of these categories and recognize that we're complicit in these categories. So you should be up here.
I just wanted to make a comment about how the build, he specified about how the build of a man gives him greater abilities. Also the fact that we've been nurtured in different ways, the social mechanisms, the food that we eat, the way that we work out, the things are different for men and for women. If we were to do as much as they were to do, our ability would possibly be at the same level.
You know, I agree, and you know, I didn't mention nutrition, but in most families, if there's food is scarce, it's given to the boys and men and the women, and as a result, you know, historically, but if 2 or 3 generations of equal eating with the same nutrition, I wonder what we'd look like as a species. I mean, so you make a really good point, a really good point.
Probably like one more question.
Yep.
Any more questions?
So this case, I hope you follow this case over the next few months. I think you should be very proud of this remarkable woman, Dati Chand. She comes from a rural background, very impoverished, very little opportunity to, well, she had nothing beyond elementary schooling, and yet out of circumstance, she's become this bright, articulate, courageous person. In my work in human rights, you can't fight a case of this kind without a human example, or test cases only work when you've got somebody who is really bulletproof in terms of somebody who's an exemplar. You know, if you're going to fight around someone, you don't want them to be always be open to criticism. Dati is exceptional in this regard, and I think the way the Sport Authority of India stepped in and did was also exemplary, and the extent that India is one that in this regard India has been a powerful supporter and defender of a more progressive approach to sport is really commendable, and I hope there'll be other, maybe with you, there'll be even more commendable examples to come out of India in the years to come. So thank you for your attention. Hope this was helpful.